Known by several names over the years, the Kentucky National Guard is among the oldest military organizations in the United States. Its history goes back over 200 years to the frontier days of the 1770s, when Kentucky was part of Virginia. During those early days, nearly every able-bodied man was considered to be a member of the militia. Militiamen were part-time soldiers. They were farmers, merchants, or tradesmen who took up arms in emergencies. There were plenty of emergencies. The Indians saw the new Kentucky settlements as the beginning of an invasion of their priceless hunting grounds. They responded with violence. Kentuckians and the Indians fought each other off and on for nearly 50 years. The Indians sent fast-moving raiding parties into Kentucky from their villages north of the Ohio River. They burned homes and crops, slaughtered livestock, and killed or kidnapped settlers. The opening of Kentucky to settlement happened at about the same time the American Revolution began. Kentucky became a battlefield in that war. The British, who also opposed the movement of settlers into Kentucky, gave the Indians weapons and other supplies and leadership. Sometimes their soldiers joined the Indians on raids into Kentucky. Kentuckians responded by fortifying their settlements and by organizing militia companies that could be called into action quickly. Often they conducted their own raids against Indian towns. George Rogers Clark provided the Kentucky Militia with leadership and strategic vision. He obtained gunpowder and soldiers from Virginia and took the fight to the British and Indians. He captured Vincennes and other British strongholds in the Old Northwest. His patrols along the Ohio River with men on horseback and in boats helped protect Kentucky settlements from British and Indian attacks. But nothing could protect Kentucky completely, as the last bloody episode of the war in Kentucky showed. In 1782, a force of about 360 Indians and Canadians loyal to Britain slipped into Kentucky. They attacked the fort at Bryan Station near Lexington. Unable to capture the fort, they headed back north. A pursuing force of Kentuckians walked into their ambush at Blue Licks. In this battle, about 66 Kentucky militiamen were killed. The battle had no influence on the outcome of the war, which ended in 1783 with independence for the former British colonies. That first generation of Kentuckians built a reputation for Kentuckians as natural fighters. Men like Daniel Boone, James Harry, and Simon Kenton gained international fame as officers in the Kentucky Militia. The long, deadly, accurate rifles carried by these men later came to be known as Kentucky rifles, partly because of the exploits of Kentucky militiamen. Later, generals of Kentuckians tried to live up to this combative image, not always with success. Neither the end of the Revolution nor the achievement of Kentucky statehood separate from Virginia in 1792 brought lasting peace to Kentucky. The British remained in place near the Canadian border and continued to support the Indians in their opposition to American growth between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. The new United States government sent several expeditions, which included many Kentucky militiamen against the Indians. Troops, led by Generals Harmer and St. Clair, met with disastrous defeats. Better trained forces won important victories at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. In 1812, the United States again went to war with Great Britain. Kentuckians supported the war, hoping to defeat the Indians once and for all, and to take Canada away from the British. The war began with tragedy for Kentucky. Overconfident but unprepared militiamen took part in the loss at the Battle of the River Raisin in what is now southern Michigan early in 1813. The British allowed their Indian allies to kill many of the wounded and captured Kentuckians after the battle had ended. Outraged Kentuckians made "Remember the Raisin" their battle cry for the rest of the war. Kentucky's most important victory came in October 1813. An American army defeated a British and Indian force beside the River Thames in Canada. Colonel Richard M. Johnson's regiment of Kentucky Mounted Riflemen charged through the enemy lines. The great Shawnee Indian leader, Tecumseh, who had attempted to unite many tribes against the Americans, was killed. This battle finally ended forever the Indian threat to Kentucky, but the goal of conquering Canada was not achieved. The war's most famous battle lay ahead. The Battle of New Orleans was fought in January 1815 after the treaty ending the War of 1812 had been signed, but before word of it reached the armies. Kentucky sent about 2,500 men to assist with General Andrew Jackson's defense of the city. Only about half of them had guns, but those who were armed played a critical role in stopping the British invasion force. In one of the American military history's most one-sided victories, the Americans killed or wounded over 2,000 British soldiers while losing only 13 killed and 58 wounded. Peace with Great Britain and the end of the Indian peril brought change to the Kentucky militia. Ever since Kentucky became a state, it had, like other states, maintained an enrolled militia system. This required nearly every man to sign up for militia service, provide himself with a weapon, and attend periodic training sessions called musters. With no serious enemies in view, most Kentuckians paid little attention to the enrolled militia. Musters, when held at all, became social gatherings that featured more drinking than drilling. Laws which required participation in the militia were not enforced. A new type of militia, the volunteer militia, became popular. Men interested in part-time military service formed the volunteer militia companies. Often the social elite in their communities, volunteer militiamen purchased stylish, expensive uniforms. They competed with other companies for snappy performance of the complicated maneuvers of the 19th century tactics. Unable to rely upon the enrolled militia, Kentucky and other states called upon volunteers to fill the regiments of soldiers required of the states by the federal government during crises. The most serious crisis during this period concerned Texas. Many Americans, including Kentuckians, had moved west and settled in Texas, then a part of Mexico, by the 1830s. In 1836, Texas fought a revolution to obtain its independence from Mexico. Kentuckians went west to help the Texans, and many of them met their deaths at the Alamo and Goliad massacres. Kentucky volunteers provided vital manpower for the final Texas victory at the Battle of San Jacinto. For 10 years, the Republic of Texas was a separate nation. In 1846, after Texas was granted statehood, an act which was intolerable to Mexico, war broke out between the two countries. Kentucky provided 3 infantry regiments and a mounted regiment for this war. The Louisville Legion, a volunteer militia battalion, provided most of the men for the 1st Kentucky Infantry, while men for the 2nd and 3rd regiments came from Lexington, the mountains of eastern Kentucky, and other parts of the state. Many of the Kentuckians fought at the Battle of Buena Vista, where General Zachary Taylor won a decisive victory over the Mexicans under General Santa Anna. A few Kentucky volunteers fought under General Winfield Scott in the campaign which led to the conquest of Mexico City. The 3rd Kentucky Regiment was part of the occupation force that garrisoned the Mexican capital until a peace treaty was signed. Many Kentuckians who fought in this war would put this military experience to good use in a much bigger war a dozen years later. Interest in the militia diminished again after the Mexican War. A major reform of the Kentucky militia system was attempted in 1860. General Simon Bolivar Buckner tried to establish a statewide organization, taking in the many volunteer militia companies. He envisioned Kentucky as having its own miniature army with distinctive uniforms, high-quality weapons, and thorough training. He called this force the Kentucky State Guard. Only the name lasted, however. The coming of the Civil War put an end to Buckner's plans. In 1861, tension between the northern and southern sections of the United States tore the country apart. Kentuckians found themselves caught between the warring factions. Most Kentuckians supported the Union, but they believed slavery was essential to their prosperous economy. It took the state some months to decide which way to go in the war. Governor Beriah Magoffin declared Kentucky neutral and ordered General Buckner's Kentucky State Guard to repel the soldiers of either the Union or the Confederacy should they enter Kentucky. Individual Kentuckians made their own decisions. The State Guard proved to be largely loyal to the Confederacy. Entire companies marched away to recruiting camps in Tennessee. Some of the Union men formed Home Guard companies. The federal government shipped weapons called Lincoln guns into Kentucky to arm them. Others enlisted in volunteer regiments, the first at recruiting camps north of the Ohio River and later at camps within Kentucky. By the end of 1861, Kentucky state government had declared itself loyal to the Union, and federal forces occupied the northern half of the state. The Kentucky State Guard had disintegrated, but Confederate troops were in place at strategic locations across southern Kentucky. Eventually, about 100,000 Kentuckians served in the Union Army. They made up 52 infantry regiments, 15 cavalry regiments, and 6 artillery batteries. African American Kentuckians, attracted by a promise of freedom from slavery in exchange for enlisting in the Army, filled several Union regiments. Kentucky's Union regiments fought all across the war's western theater. They saw heavy combat in their home state and in Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. About 40,000 Kentuckians fought in the Confederate Army. Many of them were in the 1st Kentucky Orphan Brigade, one of the most famous units on either side during the Civil War. Other Kentuckians made reputations as dashing cavalrymen, serving under John Hunt Morgan and Nathan Bedford Forrest. Their raids into Kentucky destroyed important Union supplies and facilities and kept thousands of Union soldiers busy guarding railroads, bridges, and warehouses. The Confederates lost Kentucky during the 1862 campaign. After the Battle of Perryville in October, fighting involving the major armies moved south of Kentucky's borders. But there was no peace in Kentucky. Guerrillas terrorized the state. Some of these bands of raiders supported the Union or the Confederacy, but many were simply lawless bandits who took advantage of wartime chaos to rob or murder their neighbors. Union authorities in Kentucky took drastic measures to control the guerrillas, measures so harsh that many Kentuckians who had supported the Union turned against federal authority by the end of the war. The Kentucky State Guard was reorganized as a pro-Union force, with battalions across the state to hunt down guerrillas. The end of the Civil War brought a new era of conflict to Kentucky. State Guard companies saw frequent service, on duty to control violence caused by feuds, strikes, and racial conflicts. But service in the Guard was not all grim. Units again dressed up in elaborate uniforms and took part in drill competitions and social events. War came again in 1898. This time, American troops and sailors fought the Spanish and gained an overseas empire for the United States. The Kentucky State Guard provided 3 infantry regiments and a cavalry regiment. Only the 1st Kentucky Infantry Regiment reached the combat zone in Puerto Rico during this short war, and hostilities ended before they actually went into battle. Most of the Kentucky Guardsmen spent the war in training camps fighting disease and shortages of supplies. In 1900, Kentuckians almost fought their own miniature civil war, a bitter dispute over the 1899 election for governor. Democratic candidate William Goebel was shot, sworn in as governor, and then died. The Republican incumbents refused to allow the Democrats into state buildings. Both sides called out the State Guard. For a while, pro-Republican guardsmen faced pro-Democrat guardsmen on the streets of Frankfort. The courts found a peaceful solution to the crisis, and the guardsmen went home without firing a shot. During the early years of the 20th century, State Guard troops served as peacekeepers in the so-called Black Patch War in western Kentucky. Tobacco farmers resorted to violence in their struggle against monopolistic tobacco companies. The Kentucky State Guard became the Kentucky National Guard in 1912, when a new federal law regulating the militia came into effect. The new system set training standards for state units and established more efficient procedures for mobilizing the Guard into federal service. The procedures were tested in 1916, when violence from the revolution going on in Mexico spilled across the border. Nearly all the Kentucky National Guard joined units from many other states on patrol along the Mexican border. For the first time, Kentucky troops used trucks and machine guns on active duty. Guardsmen returned from Texas in 1917, just in time to be mustered into federal service for duty in World War I. Kentucky units were attached to the 38th Cyclone Division, newly organized at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Unit titles and functions changed to fit the federal system and meet the needs of modern warfare. The 1st Kentucky Infantry became the 138th Field Artillery, and the 2nd Kentucky became the 149th Infantry. After lengthy training, men of the 38th Division went to France to serve as replacements in other units. The division never fought as a single organization, and Kentucky units soon lost their state identity. 7,518 National Guardsmen from Kentucky served in World War I. 890 Kentuckians died in the war. Americans believed that victory in World War I ensured a lasting peace. National Guard budgets were small in the 1920s and 1930s. Little could be done to modernize the Guard, although by the late 1930s the Kentucky National Guard did have its own tank company. A new mounted unit, the 123rd Cavalry Regiment, was formed as well. Guardsmen saw frequent duty near their homes. They helped victims of the Great Flood of 1937, controlled labor strikes in the coal fields, and attended annual summer training camps. Peace, in fact, did not last very long. In 1939, Europe was engulfed in another war, and Japan had invaded China. Mounting tensions between the United States and Germany and Japan made American entry into the war appear inevitable. Early in 1941, the Kentucky National Guard was mobilized. Kentuckians joined citizen soldiers from other states in training camps and on maneuvers. Many Kentucky units were again assigned to the 38th Infantry Division. Kentucky's 38th Tank Company went to the Philippine Islands as the Japanese invaders came. After a long defense of the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island, the American and Philippine defenders were overwhelmed. The Japanese force captured survivors to endure the grueling Bataan Death March and years of mistreatment in prisoner of war camps. Of the 67 Kentucky tankers captured, only 37 came home after the war. Kentucky National Guardsmen returned to the Philippines in 1944. The 38th Division cleared entrenched Japanese troops from the mountainous terrain of Luzon Island. Fighting was especially heavy in the Zigzag Pass, where an assault by the 149th Infantry, supported by the 138th Field Artillery, finally won a hard 19-day battle. The 38th Division earned the title Avengers of Bataan. Other Kentucky National Guard units fought in the European theater. The 103rd and 106th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalions, formerly a cavalry unit, fought from North Africa through France and Germany into Czechoslovakia. After the victory in World War II, the Kentucky National Guard had to face a new world, one threatened by nuclear weapons and split by a Cold War between democratic and communistic countries. In 1947, an important addition was made to the Kentucky Guard with the formation of the Kentucky Air National Guard. The Air Guard's pilots have flown F-51, F-84, and F-86 fighters, RB-57, RF-101 Voodoo, and RF-4 Phantom reconnaissance planes, C-130 Hercules transports, and other aircraft on missions all over the world. The Cold War turned hot in 1950 when the Army of Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. Early in 1951, the Kentucky National Guard 623rd Field Artillery Battalion was sent to Korea. From an advanced position in the Mungdangni Valley, the battalion fired its 155mm howitzers in support of the American 10th Corps and the 1st Korean Division. Other Cold War crises also required mobilization of Kentucky Guard units. The 123rd Armor and other units were activated during the Berlin crisis of 1961. Air Guard photo recon planes flew over Korea during the USS Pueblo seizure incident in 1968. In 1968, the 2nd Battalion of the 138th Artillery went to Vietnam. From hilltop positions such as Firebase Bastogne, Tomahawk Hill, and Hamburger Hill, the Kentucky gunners supported troops of the 101st Airborne Division, a regular